And we are live. I am here joined by my co-host Elijah Yassi, and we have a very, very special guest joining us today, the incredible, the one and only, the Reverend Dr. Father Brian Daley. How are you doing this evening, Father?
I'm doing fine. Thank you very much. It's beautiful. I'm in Washington, D.C., as I mentioned before, and it's a beautiful spring day right now. All the flowers are out and the trees are in bud. And it makes you really feel good to be in the changing seasons.
That is wonderful, and really thrilled to be able to be here and to dialogue with you on a very, very important topic. And as you know very well, Father, we were talking about it before we went live.
Right.
Very few work. Not a whole lot of people have done work in this incredible field. The amount of work you have done, we thank you from the bottom of our hearts, myself and the brother Elijah, on the incredible work that you've done when it comes to the Dormition, when it comes to the Assumption of Mary. Your work is the essential on this topic. And I just, before we really go into talking about anything of it, can you maybe tell the audience, what is it that you do? Why did you decide to work in this very specialized field, and what have pretty much anything about yourself you want to talk about?
Well, thanks. I mean, I've been interested pretty much all my life in the ancient civilizations of the world, in Greece and Rome and their languages and their literature. I was a classics major in college, and then when I became a Jesuit, entered the Jesuit order, and was invited to think about teaching theology, it was kind of natural to want to teach the theology of the early church. And to read more deeply into their writings and learn more about personalities that wrote these things. I was lucky enough to be sent to Frankfurt in Germany to do theology. And my teacher there, my main teacher, we had a lot of different ones, but the one I worked with most closely was Father Alois Grillmeyer. And he was a great scholar on the Christology of the early church, the understanding of the person and the natures of Christ as it developed through the first 7 or 8 centuries. And so under his leadership, I got into this sort of thing myself, and then did a doctorate on that, and have been back in the United States ever since. I taught, first of all, in the Jesuit School of Theology in Cambridge, Mass. Now it's part of Boston College. I was there for 18 years. And then I was invited to go to Notre Dame in Indiana with a wonderful theology department there, and to teach early Christian theology at Notre Dame for the next 25 years. And I just retired from that last June in the midst of the COVID crisis, but ready to step down. And so I moved from Notre Dame. I'm now living at Georgetown in the Jesuit community in Washington, D.C., and trying to do some writing and research, and hopefully some teaching here when things pick up again. But I've been doing this kind of thing for pretty much all my adult life. And it's been incredibly rich and rewarding to do that and to learn about how our faith in Jesus and who he is, but also in his mother Mary, in his family, and in what he preached, his message, especially on the end of the world, how all that kind of developed and took shape in the first 7 or 8 centuries. And so I've done writing on that and translations, and basically focused on that through my life as a teacher and as a Jesuit priest.
Now, Father, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you are the very first one that brought light to a figure that we have found to be very enigmatic, very interesting, important, that being Theotechnos, who really, you bring up that name. In fact, try Googling him. You're not going to get a hit. It's almost impossible, but I believe you are the one that provided the very first, or if not the very first, the only complete English translation, which, as we were talking about before the show, is loaded with theology in terms of Mary. What was it like to be able to translate such an incredible document?
Oh, it was really fun. The origin of that, as I was telling you briefly before, is that I've taught courses on the Christian tradition about Mary for years. And one of the things that I wanted to look at with a class, this is back in Boston and also at Notre Dame, was the origins and the initial meaning of this celebration that we have in the summer of the Dormition, as it's called in the East, or the Assumption into heaven of Mary, her being taken up from this world to share in the resurrection and risen life of Jesus. And I found that there were very few texts really available in translation. So I started hunting around, and there are articles on this, mainly in French. They've done a lot of good work on this, and surveys pointing out who it was that had written about this. And so I started looking up his source books and came across Theotechnos and some of the other early writers on the Dormition. But he's one of the first to explain and preach about the feast that was, by that time, pretty well established in the eastern part of Christianity, in Jerusalem first, and then in Syria, Egypt, and further east in Iraq today. And we could talk more about this, but like many other feasts that we have in the church, in the Catholic Church, the Western Church, the origins of it come from Jerusalem. And it was originally celebrated by Christians there, kind of on the site, close to where the memories of Mary and Jesus and the apostles were most live. And then from there, liturgies and feasts tended to spread to Egypt, to Syria, then to Constantinople, and then eventually, maybe a couple hundred years later, to Rome and to the tradition that we share as Roman Catholics.
Really, really incredible there. And the one thing that I was telling you that the brother Elijah and myself, we're really fascinated working in one of the areas we really specialize in is talking about the Immaculate Conception, doing research in that, and the Dormition and the Assumption. And one thing that we noticed, as I was telling you, is kind of like a bit of a common theme in the homilies, particularly in the ones that you've done an incredible job of translating, that being, despite us not having the dogma of the Immaculate Conception broken down piece by piece, we've been fascinated that you can extrapolate the idea of our holy Theotokos having an all immaculate nature. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's to me always fascinating, it still is, that Mary becomes a real central preoccupation of the Christian community from very early on. Before there are feasts or theological treatises or sermons about her, she's obviously central in the mind of Christians. We have a document from the 2nd century called the Proto-Evangelium, or the Book of James. And it probably comes from around 140, 150. We don't know exactly. Again, probably comes from Palestine, maybe from Syria, or somewhere in the east, in the not too far east. And it tells basically the story of the birth of Mary through Anna and Joachim, her childhood, her engagement to Joseph, an older man, and their marriage, and then ultimately the annunciation of the coming of Jesus, her son. So it kind of adds narrative material to what we have in the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of Matthew. And it's a very beautiful work. I mean, is it historical? We don't know. I mean, it obviously involves traditions that were important to people at that time. But that comes before any of the attempts to explain what was going on. Now, I don't know if you've ever been to Jerusalem, but in Jerusalem, of course, there are sites that commemorate all sorts of events in the life of the Lord and in the life of the early church. And in the Kidron Valley, really across the street, across the main street from the Garden of Gethsemane, is what is honored still as Mary's tomb. It was apparently a basilica, a big church, and the upper part of it had been taken down through the ages. But if you go down a long flight of steps, you get into the crypt, the basement, and down there under the floor of the original church is the site of what has been honored by Christians, at least, as Mary's tomb since very early on. Then up in the city, there's her house. Again, it's the site anyway that's honored as where she lived and died. And so some of the narratives that we have talk about her dying in her house, then her body being carried down into the valley of Kidron and being laid in a sepulcher, something like the Holy Sepulchre of Jesus on the other side of Jerusalem. And so people obviously have been venerating that since very early. We know that about the year 350, the wife of the emperor, Pulcheria, her name was, financed the building of a big basilica over the tomb of Mary. That's no longer there, but that was where it was built. And there were presumably liturgies there were processions, there were devotional exercises from the mid-4th century. We also know from narrative sources that people celebrated her death and did it with liturgies and talked about it even earlier than that, maybe about 350, 375. We don't have any documents on that, but we have narratives in the chronicles telling us that this was being done in Jerusalem. And so it's a very ancient tradition to honor the place where her life, her human life, came to an end, understandably so. And as you know, what you can find in some of these homilies that we have and narrative sources is the story that's something like this, that Mary died, that she carried down into the Kidron Valley and laid in a sepulcher there, and that one of the apostles, Thomas, well, it's always Thomas who gets there late, arrived after she was buried. So he was talking to his brothers, the other apostles, and said, "Where is the life of the body of our mother? How can I venerate this?" So they took him down to her tomb. And when they got there, they found the tomb was open. It's the same as the story of Jesus. And they peeked inside, which you still do today. And there was nothing there. It was empty. And so from that, then the celebration, the idea developed that she had taken up in a kind of a version of the resurrection of Jesus, taken up in her body as well as her soul, and joined with him in the glory of the Father. And the story kind of begins with that narrative core, and then what we have are reflections on that, mainly liturgical reflections. We know that there was a liturgical celebration in Jerusalem from at least the mid 6th century, from in 550, something like that. And we know also in Egypt, there was an ancient celebration of the death and glorification of Mary, probably around the same time. And the celebration in Jerusalem was done not just by Greek-speaking Christians, but by Syriac-speaking Christians, by Arabic-speaking Christians, by Egyptians, by people from different parts of the Eastern Church. And that liturgical common celebration seems to be the origin of what we venerate as her Dormition, as her being taken up in glory to be with her Son. I go on more, but that's where we start.
That really is incredible, Father. And you make a great point that early on we have all of these, all this evidence of celebrations of feast days of the end of Mary's life. I wonder if when you were doing the incredible work of translating these homilies, was there any evidence that any of these fathers, or is there any evidence that by the time that the Dormition and Assumption was being celebrated as a festival, was there any kind of festival in terms of not the end of her life, but the beginning, her conception? Was there any is there any evidence of any festival of that around that time period?
Not exactly that early.
Okay.
There is evidence that a feast of the birth of Mary was celebrated probably from the 6th or 7th century. You know, what we celebrate on September 8th. And then, of course, if you reckon back 9 months before that, if she's born on September 8th, then she has to be conceived 9 months before that on December 8th.
Yeah.
We have the story from the Proto-Evangelium that I mentioned before of her parents, Joachim and Anna, of the way that they conceived her in a very chaste way, simply by embracing. And that Mary, by God's grace, comes to be in her mother's womb in order to be the one who was the mother of Jesus. So we have that tradition. There's probably a feast of Mary's conception from about the 7th century. And that kind of comes to the West too. The general pattern is, as I mentioned, that you have feasts celebrated in the Middle East, in Jerusalem, in Cairo, what is Cairo today, in Damascus and so on. And they gradually migrate west. They come to Constantinople, then to northern Greece, and ultimately to Rome maybe 100 years later. So there's a feast of the conception of Mary in the Western Church, the Latin Church, from the Carolingian period, about 800. But notice that it's a feast of her conception, of her being conceived in the womb of her mother. What we think of as the Immaculate Conception is kind of a later version, a later idea that's kind of added on to that. It's obviously very closely related, but it's tied in with the development of a notion of original sin and effects, which really only develops in the West in the 12th century. And as you may know, the idea that Mary was conceived utterly free from any share in what we think of as original sin, or the effects of original sin, was resisted by a lot of major theologians for quite a while, by St. Anselm and St. Thomas Aquinas and others who thought, we don't want to quite say that. Thomas Aquinas presents her as being conceived in original sin, but saved from it through the grace of God because of Christ about 3 months after her conception, before she was actually delivered. So it's kind of a twist on that, which may seem odd to us. But the idea that she never had any share in what we see as the human fall is really something that a lot of people thought we should say.
Yeah, which is a great point, which is why we notice that really when we look at certain fathers, and even when we have them using language that may seem to indicate Mary was, had human infirmities or what have you, that is interesting that comes up later in discussions of the great Blessed Duns Scotus and other fathers who are saying, okay, what does this mean then? And Blessed Duns Scotus and others would say, well, okay, this is what I think. And we have some fathers that would say, some theologians medieval that would say, okay, you know what? Well, Mary was immaculately conceived, but she may have had that debitum peccati. You know how it opens up the whole realm into all these other discussions, doesn't it, Father?
Yeah, I think the issue for a lot of people, say for Thomas Aquinas,
yeah,
he wants to say she's a fully human person.
Yeah.
Jesus is fully human, but he's also fully divine. So Jesus is unique. But Mary, his mother, was not divine. She was deeply graced and blessed, and she was a human being. And so she has to be saved like anybody else. With the assumption that every human being has to be redeemed through the grace of Christ. And so if Mary is human fully and nothing else, then she too must be saved or redeemed by the grace of Christ, our Son. For Thomas, that meant, well, she must have existed for a while,
yeah, not
redeemed. I mean, you can't get saved if you're not saved from something. And so how do we imagine that? How do we think that? And his way of doing it was to say, well, she must have been, in the effects of original sin for about 3 months, 4 months. And then before she's actually delivered, the grace of Christ redeems her. And then Blessed Duns Scotus comes along and says, if she is redeemed by her Son 3 months after conception, why isn't she simply prevented from being touched by original sin from the very beginning? So he thinks of a sort of a retroactive salvation.
Yeah.
That the grace of Christ actually works backward and prevents her ever from being touched or contaminated by original sin. But that was a later idea. And the Dominican and Franciscans kind of fought about that for several hundred years, as you know.
Oh, yeah, no doubt. But I've always thought that Blessed Duns Scotus in his hearkening to Genesis 3:15 and saying, hey, this could have happened before because of the prophecy, even before Mary came into existence. I've always thought it to be quite compelling, quite compelling theology. But getting back to the issue of the Dormition and the Assumption, one thing that has always really fascinated me, and I wonder, really excited to pick your brain on it. We think of Epiphanius or Epiphanius, depending how people like to pronounce it. When we look at his Panarion and we notice him talking about the Assumption of Mary, before that, we rarely heard much about Mary's end, the end of her life. What could have happened to her? Why do you think that is the case? Do you think that they were more concerned with other issues, the Trinity, Christology? What are your opinions on that?
Well, that's a very interesting question. It's hard to know. But Epiphanius is a great reporter. He wants to chronicle every variation on Christian faith that was known to him. And so his work, one of his works, is a kind of a catalog of heresies, talking about all the different ways people get the Christian faith kind of mixed up or distorted. And he also is very attentive to local liturgies, local celebrations, local sites. He came from Cyprus. Salamis, where his bishop is, on the island of Cyprus. And so he knew what was going on in, we think it was Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Israel today, probably much better than people further west would have done. So he probably had been to Jerusalem himself and had seen these celebrations at Mary's tomb. And he tells us a lot of information about the early liturgies and the early understandings of the death of Mary. But this at an early time. Epiphanius is writing about 380, 390. And so it was all kind of in flux at that time. There was devotion, but we don't know exactly what it was like or how they did it. There aren't any documents besides him from that period. And so, we simply have to rely on on what he tells us and how people were obviously interested in Mary and focusing their devotion on her, and also saying if she died in the grace of Christ, her son, she must be with him in heaven in some sense. And so it's kind of an outflow of their faith in her uniqueness, in her, being especially graced by God.
That is a fantastic response, Father. And I want to ask you one more question, then I want to pass it over to my co-host Elijah. The one thing that really has always really fascinated me is at times you tend to hear from our Protestant friends, our Protestant brothers and sisters, that they'll say, well, you know what, the Dormition and the Assumption, it's so late in history. You don't hear about it until the 1900s. But the one thing that I've noticed from a lot of my friends within Catholicism, Syriac Orthodoxy, Eastern Orthodoxy, pretty much every branch that we can call a branch of ancient Christianity, I've noticed that it seems like we all hold to these ancient traditions on the Dormition and the Assumption. Would it be fair to say that the ancient branches of the church share this in common, believing in this Dormition and Assumption of Mary?
I think in a general way, it is fair to say that. In fact, for Mary's Dormition, we have more documents and liturgies, liturgical fragments from Egypt, from Syria, from other languages besides Greek than we do for other things. But I think people probably have different understandings of this. And the problem is to figure out, what are they really trying to tell us? One point that's quite clear is that they assume that Mary at death was taken immediately into the glory of God. Now, do you understand her body being taken up into heaven as we believe now? Or is it simply a spiritual sharing of the grace of the risen Christ? It's kind of hard to tell sometimes. She's seen as the embodiment of redeemed humanity. St. John of Damascus, and also St. What's the name of Crete?
Andrew.
Yeah. Andrew of Crete.
Yeah.
3 beautiful homilies on her. They talk about her being all beautiful, being preserved by God from anything that disfigures the human, form and the human behavior. So how literally do we understand that? It's a way of saying that she is, in a way, the perfect achievement of God's creation. She's what God intended humanity to be like. And at the end of her life, it seems obvious that she'd be taken with her son, who is also a fully glorified human, into the glory of the Father. She'd be the first to share in his glory. But what we're saying about her in this feast, too, is that she has been raised from the dead. So her present condition is something exactly like the risen Christ, her son. But it's what we hope for all of us. And we're not saying that none of us will ever achieve this. We hope that all of us, at the end of the history at least, will be taken up to share in the glory of the risen Christ. So it's a promise for humanity too. She's fully human, and yet she's taken to share in the beauty and the transformation of Jesus, her son. And I think that's all built in. It's an expression of hope and of the assertion that this comes through Jesus and in the resurrection of Jesus.
That's incredible, Father. Father, thank you so much. I'll pick your brain again in a bit, God willing. I want to pass it over to my dear brother, my co-host Elijah. Elijah, you had some questions for Father.
I do. I just want to make sure you guys can hear me first.
Yes.
Great.
Sweet. First, thank you, William, for having me on here. It's a pleasure to co-host with you every time I'm on here with you. And Father, it's a pleasure to talk to you. I've been reading the book for the past 7 years.
Elijah.
What was that?
It's great to meet you, I say, and to talk.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you, Father. Thank you. On the Dormition, I always recommend this book every time I talk about recommending books on Mary or just talking about the Dormition. So everyone on the Dormition of Mary, one of the best books I've read is the translation of the homilies by the Greek fathers on the Dormitions. I do have some questions here, and some of my questions might be a little too specific.
You're kind of breaking up.
I've been curious about. What was that?
You were breaking up there. Sorry, your voice was not
breaking up.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
You're good now. You're good
So
now.
I was gonna say, okay, sweet, sweet. So I wanted to see if I could ask this question about Saint John Damascene. On page 207, homily 2, he has a quote that he says, "But now Mary has shaken off all the assaults of passion, and has planted again the shoot of obedience to God our Father, introducing life in you for all her race." Now, is that a reference, and I'm sorry if I'm putting you on the spot and if you need the context of that, but is that a reference to Mary having concupiscence and temptations, fighting them off? Or what was that?
Can you say that again? I didn't get the, it wasn't coming through.
So is that a reference to Mary having concupiscence and temptations,
right,
and fighting them off? Or is that a reference to a contrast between Eve introducing the assaults of for the human race while Mary shakes them off and places obedience to God for the human race? Does that make sense?
You know, I think it's certainly a parallel to Eve and a parallel to the fallen condition that we're all finding ourselves in. You know, that Mary is God's new creation. She sort of embodies what God, the Creator, and Jesus, the Redeemer, had in mind for humanity, for men and women, and which has really never fully succeeded because of our sinfulness. And I think they see the Dormition, the Assumption of Mary, not simply as something happening to her body, but as a kind of a recreation of her whole humanity, a forming of her as in pristine form, in beauty, and in her likeness to Christ, her son. She is the first of the new creation. And John of Damascus brings that out very beautifully. But it's conceived a little.
Appreciate that answer, Father.
Sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Father.
It's conceived of a little differently from the way that Western theologians after the Middle Ages would have conceived it by connecting it with original sin, which is really not properly an Eastern Christian notion until much later.
That makes sense. That makes sense. And this question has to do with her body and her corruption. What did these Greek fathers believe about Mary's body after death? Was it corruptible, or was there grace that made sure it wasn't corruptible? Or did they talk about that at all in their Dormitions?
They do. I think John of Damascus does. I haven't read that in several years now. But I think, like Jesus, the idea is not that he or that she was utterly incorruptible, not exposed to corruption, but that in fact their bodies did not corrupt because God took them to heaven very quickly. It's like if you read the story of the resurrection of Jesus at Easter, he's laid in the tomb on Good Friday afternoon, and then they discover that his body is not there on Sunday morning. So it's simply been there for the equivalent of one day, a little bit more than 24 hours. And they find that he is again alive, but in a transformed way. He can appear to people, and his body radiates light and beauty and so on. Well, I think the idea in the Dormition of Mary is to apply that same notion to Mary after her death. That they all emphasize that she did really die. She wasn't just taken up into heaven without dying. She's taken through death and beyond death in her body. So it isn't just her soul is in heaven, but her whole self, her whole humanity shares the glory of Christ. And it's really talking about a resurrection in Mary, which is caused by and modeled after the resurrection of Jesus, her son. So it depends on his resurrection, but it's realized in her too. I think if there's,
Yeah, go ahead, Father. Yeah, go ahead, Father.
Sorry.
We had a little bit of feedback there, I think, from Elijah. Elijah, whenever you if you get that fixed, I just put mute so the feedback wouldn't be so loud. Okay, I think Elijah's working on that connection. There, you get that fixed, Elijah? Okay, there you go.
All right. Sorry about that. I'm actually at my in-laws' house, and I don't do shows here, so this is why I'm having some technical difficulties. I apologize about that.
I fully understand it. Zoom is not easy to manage sometimes, and so you get feedback on various things. But anyway, thanks for taking care of that.
Absolutely, absolutely. So my other question, I appreciate that answer as well. My other question is, do the Dormition homilists give Mary any sort of privileges that only Adam and Eve enjoyed prior to the fall? And if so, what are those privileges?
I'm not aware that any of them refer to the privileges of Adam and Eve. I mean, they do see her as the beginning of a restored humanity. In that sense, she recaptures in her own person, body and soul, the beauty and the freshness and the vitality of the life in the Garden of Eden. And so, again, John of Damascus, Andrew of Crete will invoke the parallel with paradise, with Eden, as explaining what happens to her. But I don't think they go into great detail of her, her various gifts. We do that later in modern homilies on the Dormition. But I think just the idea that she's the new beginning, she's the new Eve, and what you see in her is what humanity was intended to be from the beginning.
And touching upon that new beginning, do they mention at what point this new creation or new beginning started? Was it at the Annunciation? Is that when it took on the full completion? As I know Father Kappas has a thesis on this where he talks about her becoming more holy at the Annunciation. Is that where they would say this new creation, this new embodiment of new humanity started, was at the Annunciation?
Well, yes, in one way, because it's at the Annunciation that she conceives in her womb the Savior who brings about the new creation. And so her voluntary acceptance of God's offer, her saying yes to God's plan, which begins at the Annunciation, is really the beginning of a story of Christian salvation, of the salvation of the world. But you don't see that in her own life and her own person until after her death. I mean, Mary, has an ordinary life, apparently. She grows old. Joseph apparently dies quite early because he's thought to be much older than she. She's grieving at the foot of the cross. She suffers what a mother would suffer at that terrible moment. And it's only at the end of her life, when she's laid to rest, that this new creation begins to show itself in her, when they find her tomb is empty too. So she's raised from the dead as well. But nobody probably would have known that. Even she would not have known that until the beginning of her life with Christ in heaven. That's why the Dormition is so important. It's saying that the fulfillment of her trust and her faith begins in her empty tomb. That what happened to Jesus happened to her.
That's a fantastic, beautiful answer. My other question has to do with Adam and Eve. When they were in paradise, they were supposed to pass the test, right, and then they were supposed to ascend into heaven, from paradise to heaven. Is that the reasoning behind Christ's ascension and Mary's bodily assumption? Is it because they passed the test that Adam and Eve failed, and is that why there was a bodily assumption and ascension? Is there a connection there?
That idea of Adam and Eve being destined to be taken up bodily into heaven only appears in a few, later documents. It's kind of what they call an apocryphal idea. That isn't necessarily part of the biblical narrative. But I think the idea of being taken up into heaven, of ascending beyond this present earth, is the way ancient people imagined salvation. That we live here distant from God, in a place that's subject to labor and pain and struggle. And eventually, as Jesus was, we'll be taken up into a better world, a place which is surrounding God in glory. And you find that notion in a lot of ancient documents. There's a wonderful document from the 2nd century, for instance, called the Ascension of Isaiah, which tells the story about the prophet Isaiah being executed for his witness to the coming Christ, and then being taken up through the various levels of the heavens into the presence of God. And he sees Christ, the Word, descending to earth and accomplishing in his own self what saves us all. And Isaiah witnesses to this. So a very interesting document, but that's probably from around 150, 160. The idea is there. It's the way people imagined salvation. There's no better way to talk about it. So both Jesus and Mary are laid in the tomb. The tomb is empty after a couple of days. And people realize that the body as well as the soul of Jesus and Mary, are now at the right hand of God and in the presence of God. But I think they later applied that to Adam and Eve, but Mary and Jesus, as far as I know, were the first ones to have that applied. It's applied to Isaiah as well and to other biblical characters.
That's a fantastic answer, Father. I do have a question again. This is from John Damascene's homily too. When he talks about Mary's being, he says, for how could she who brimmed over with true life for all ever become subject to death? And then he says something really interesting that's always puzzled me. Still she yields to the law established by her own son, and as a daughter of the old Adam, she undergoes the ancestral trial, since even her son, life itself, did not refuse it. And it sounds like he's saying she voluntarily chose to die, sort of implying as if she didn't have to die. And I know it's, symbolic and poetic language, but can you touch upon what he's talking about there if possible?
Well, you might say the same about Jesus. Did he have to die on the cross? No, I mean, Jesus freely accepts the human lot of death and of suffering, and in accepting that, lives out fully his mission from the Father as our Savior. And it's because of him that Mary is seen as living out her human vocation. But most of those sermons in the volume that I translated don't imply that she didn't have to die, that because she was a human person, and humans are mortal, and so we all, by being mortal, we have to live through that death as well as life. There are some people later on who question that, whether because she was free from sin, she had to die. But I mean, that is introducing something which is really not present in the early homilies, I don't think. She's a human person who dies. And I think, I have to look at them again, but I think John of Damascus makes that clear at the end of his third homily, and also Andrew of Crete makes it clear. She shares our humanity in every way, even our weakness and our death. And because of that, she redeemed fully by Christ and brought into the presence of God.
Fantastic answer. And William, I think that's all. I mean, I have like 15 million other questions, but I think I'm going to stop there. I don't want to hog the mic. And I appreciate, Father, you answering all my questions here. Really, really excellent.
Well, thank you, Elijah. Thank you for really interesting and penetrating questions on these things.
Thank you.
Yeah, I gotta hand it to Elijah. Those are really, really good questions there. They're fantastic, and I think he brings up a lot of very interesting things, and you do too as well, Father, when you point out how Andrew of Crete, John Damascene, I think even others note that Mary was human, as Epiphanius would have argued. We don't worship Mary. She's not a god. She's a human. We venerate her. And the one thing that I think people fail to realize, Father, and I think that is why understanding the Dormition and the Assumption homilies and how they tie in with Mary's all immaculate nature is, we have no problem saying Mary could have grieved at the cross. We have no problem saying Mary mourned at the cross. I mean, to claim that she wouldn't have would be crazy. And none of that would contradict the Immaculate Conception. But sometimes people tend to confuse grieve and all these things and say, this is evidence that that these fathers believed that Mary, had original sin, or Mary was sinful. But that was the furthest thing from their mind, wasn't it, when they were writing those homilies?
Well, the notion of original sin is something that's more emphasized in the West, in the Latin tradition, than it is in the Eastern traditions. And a reason for that is a tradition in the West, going back to St. Augustine and others, that sees all of humanity as having shared in the sin of Adam and Eve and experienced its effects. And so if you read some of Augustine's later documents, which are really beautiful things, you see the sense that sin is something that we share in, not because it's naturally, ours, but because it's something that we all went through in our first parents. Sin is something that we chose to do, but we chose to do not as individuals, but as a race, as the descendants of Adam and Eve. And so the effects of that alienation are still with us, and all of our rebellion against God and our physical infirmities come from that. Now, that's a tradition that the West has emphasized very much. In the East, it isn't put in quite the same way. It doesn't seem as everybody sharing in sin. If you talk to an Orthodox Christian, they would say, we don't have an idea of original sin, which is partly true and partly not, I think, but they don't put it in those terms anyway. They certainly believe that humanity, as it is now, is damaged goods, that there is some suffering that we undergo simply by being born that comes from our being descendants of Adam and Eve. Everybody accepts that. That comes out of Genesis 3 and 4.
Yep.
But they wouldn't put it in the terms of sin and guilt and its effects on us. And that's tradition, the idea that we share the sin of Adam and Eve really gets emphasized in the West in the 12th and 13th century. It's debated back and forth. And eventually, as we mentioned before, under Blessed John Duns Scotus, it becomes kind of the standard Catholic tradition. And we still affirm that today. And then to speak of an immaculate conception of Mary, to say that she was exempt as the only human being from this share in original sin, say that is to express things in a very Western way. Yeah. So we have to be a little more cautious in ascribing that to, say, Andrew of Crete or John of Damascus, even though they believe that she is the first human being to be fully redeemed and fully enlivened, to share fully in the life that the risen Jesus has. So it's a different way of putting it, I think. But
yeah, I get you totally. In other words, we would be, I guess, more qualified in our language. We could say that whereas John of Damascus and maybe Andrew of Crete weren't privy to everything that we're laying down, either which way they're teaching, like, would it be okay to say they taught that Mary had an all holy, all immaculate nature?
In fact, that title, the all holy one, Panagia in Greek,
yeah,
used by certainly by John of Damascus. And he emphasizes that a lot, that in her we can see human holiness, not the holiness of the Son of God even, but totally human. She's a human person. Yeah. She's a creature. And yet by her freedom and by the grace of God, she is what God intended us all to be, and what he calls us all to be. And that's why she's so important, I think.
That's a fantastic point, because we notice that, and we can extrapolate that from John of Damascus, and from that. That's the one thing I've noticed that is so incredible in these Dormition and Assumption homilies, that you look at them, and I think people maybe don't realize one thing that really does blow me away, Father, is that sometimes you're looking at some of these amazing homilies, which, by the way, people, I recommend they get your book on that and anything you've done, because your work is essential in this field. So check out Father Brian Daley's book, The Dormition Homilies of Mary. Check that out. Anything Father has done, it's mind-blowingly good. And before we end the show in a little bit, Father, I'm going to let you put a plug in for anything you're doing. But the one thing that I've noticed working a lot in the realms of Mariology is, by the time we get to some of these Dormition and Assumption homilies, you go line by line, and you can extrapolate so much amazing theology that they believe, that the way they venerated our mother by then. Some of these homilies teaching about her all immaculate nature in the very same vein as talking about her being Mother of God, the Dormition, the Assumption, and her being perpetual virgin. I mean, just they're loaded with Mariology, aren't they?
Right. Absolutely. And to me, one of the interesting things is that this is first expressed in devotion, in liturgy, in prayer. And we know that it was a focus of liturgy from the 2nd century. And then it's expressed in narration, in stories. And then finally, it's kind of analyzed and explained in homilies and in theology. So the order begins with prayer and liturgy, and then ends in theology. And that's important for us to remember too, I think. So what we say about her, the story we tell about her, reveals how we understand how God works in the world and in human beings.
Incredible point, Father. I want to ask you maybe just one other question, and then you can maybe talk about what your work, what you're working on, anything new you've got down the line. One thing that I remember reading about and just being totally fascinated by was one thing that I didn't even know about. I guess maybe a lot of people don't even realize that I recently talked about it, and I mentioned a footnote, actually more than a footnote in a book that you've provided work for. It was in regards to Jacob of Serug. And that was being, when he talks about the Dormition and the Assumption of Mary, you point out something that was mind-blowing to me. It's how he presented, I believe, that, I don't know if it's a poem, if you will, a document at a council of Nisibis, I believe. I don't know if you recall that. Do you remember that?
Jacob of Serug, yeah.
Yeah, that mind-blowing.
Yeah.
So let me just be certain for the audience that are tuning in. Would he have read this at this council of the church, or would he have presented it? How would that have worked?
In his homily, we have a lot. Jacob of Serug was a bishop and attended a number of councils in what today would be Syria and Iraq. He was from the eastern part of Syria at that time, and it was a Syrian Orthodox bishop in the late 5th century. And we have a lot of homilies of Jacob of Serug, not all of them published even yet, but we have like 50 or 60 homilies, I forget how many, that are out, and some of them are translated. There's a set of them translated published by St. Vladimir's Press, a beautiful translation too, homilies on Mary and also other homilies of Jacob of Serug. They're really worth looking at and praying about. But I think he represents the tradition of a believing Orthodox church, which uses different language and different imagery from what we think of as Greek or Latin Orthodoxy. Yeah. And one of the interesting things to me in reading early Christian writings is to get out of the realm of simply Greek and Latin writers and to read what people from the Semitic language school, from different linguistic and liturgical traditions would have believed and would have said, well, what would have been meaningful to them? Because we all share this common vocation of being Christians. So reading Jacob of Serug is really important, I think.
No doubt, no doubt. Father, I want to, before we wrap up, I want to give you a chance to maybe put in a plug. Are you working on a new book? Are you writing anything new? We sure hope you're doing something new. Are you working on anything? What do you have down the pipeline?
Well, these homilies all came out from St. Vladimir's Press, which is the Orthodox publisher in New York.
Yep.
I have good friends there, and they do beautiful work. I love those little volumes they put out there. Inexpensive, but they're very nicely done. So I have just done for them a set of homilies, or essays rather, by Gregory of Nyssa, 7 works by Gregory of Nyssa, and that will come out sometime this year in the same series. Not homilies really, but theological treatises. I've done another set of treatises this past summer. I mean, COVID gives us lots of time on late Christology, on the disputes of the 7th century in terms of whether Christ had one will or two wills. It gets kind of technical, but it's very interesting. And I hope that St. Vladimir's will bring that out too. And the big thing, I did a book a couple of years ago, which Oxford University Press brought out, called it was kind of an overview of Christology in the early church, and it was called God Visible. That's a phrase from St. Irenaeus, who sees in Christ the visible of the invisible God. So the title of the book that I put on it was God Visible, and that's kind of a survey of ancient Christology from the beginnings up to about the end of the 7th century, the 680s. So if you're really interested in this stuff, you might have a look at that. That's coming out in paperback next month. It's out in a hardback now, but like a lot of things from Oxford, it's expensive in a hardback version. But the paperback will be a lot cheaper, I think. And that might be worth looking at if you're interested in the Christology side of things, God Visible. So those are a few things anyway that I have my finger in.
Yeah, that's a really good point that you bring that up, Father, because as you know very well, having worked in Christology and Mariology, they get tied together so well. We recognize that a lot of these early heretics that denied all sorts of things of Mary also denied the divinity of Christ, or maybe spoke of him having one nature, one will. So, I mean, that is very, very important. So is that that will be released by that is by Oxford.
Well, the actual translations of the early documents will come out from St. Vladimir's, I hope. But Oxford has the kind of the narrative book, the history of Christology up until 680, 700. And so that's available already in hardback, and it's coming out in paperback this summer. So.
Is there any possibility that you write anything else Mariology related?
Well, I could. What I've been doing up to now has been translations, partly because they're not readily available. But I've done lots of articles on Mariology in various journals. But maybe I'll put those together and come out with a book of, a history of the devotion to Mary or something like that.
That would be great.
Yeah. Well,
we'd love that, Father, and God willing, if that does come out next month, we'd love to bring you back to talk about Christology. We'd love to have you back.
Well, let's do that sometime. Yeah.
We will do it. Father, before we wrap up, Elijah, brother, did you have any closing comments that you wanted to say to Father before we wrap up?
I just wanted to say thank you, Father, for being on. And you mentioned Jacob of Saruja. It's one William and I, we always talk about Saint Jacob of Saruja. Well, I'm a Syriac Catholic, so I can call him a saint, I guess, but I know he's not a communion with Rome. And I have that book that you mentioned and about his Marian homilies. Very fascinating homilies. I love them. And the Christology debate is endless. I'm sure you know the debate between the Oriental Orthodox and the Catholic side. We're always talking about that with William. So we'd love to have you back. Go ahead, Father.
Can you read ancient Syriac?
I cannot. No, I can also read the translated.
There's lots of wonderful documents from the early church in Syriac, which enrich our faith. Yeah.
Absolutely. So yeah, thank you again, Father, for being on, and thank you, William, for having me on. This was fantastic. This was one of my favorite shows I've ever done.
Well, thank you both. I mean, it's a great privilege for me to be able to talk about these things with you and to share in your enthusiasm for our tradition and for the liturgical and theological tradition of all the churches. What unites us is so much more important than what separates us. And I think we really have to remember
Amen.
that.
Amen. Father, thank you so much for your time, and we look forward to dialoguing with you again. I will be in touch with you again. For the audience, I promise you I will do my best. Pray for Father Daley, his ministry, everything he does. And Father, would you mind blessing us with a closing prayer?
Well, sure. Lord our God, we ask you to be with us, to send us your grace from heaven, the grace that purified and made faithful Mary, your servant, and all the saints. We ask you to be with us through Jesus Christ, to give us your strength and your glory, and to help us to hope for a share in his resurrection and hers. And we ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Father, thank you so much, and I will be in touch. God bless you.
God bless you too. Thanks.